They call her the Veil-born. Even now, the name hums in my bones, like a memory I never earned. She's taller than any ship has right to be, with sails like silver wings, and a hull carved from living wormwood, still breathing, they say, though the tree she came from has been dead 100 years. The sailors whisper that her heart pulses in the deep part of the keel, a low thrum that only the truly bound can feel. I feel it, even now, if I close my eyes. She was one of 3 vessels in the Emerald Fleet, the pride of Solmaris. Her sister ships, Starflare and Nightwood, never drew the kind of oar she did. Maybe it was the way she cut through the harbor fog, like she didn't belong to water at all. Maybe it was the enchantments woven into every plank, humming just beneath the wood, like old music waiting to be remembered. Or maybe it was just the name, Veil-born, something that sounded half made of myth. I never thought I'd see her up close, much less serve aboard her. I was a dock rat, Cal Brenner, son of no one, born in the salt-wet gutters of Old Harbor. I grew up half-starved and barefoot, watching ships come and go like gods I wasn't allowed to worship. I learned rope work before I could write, knots before I could count, and how to lie to customs officers before I'd ever touched a book. But fate's funny like that. They lost 2 men the week before departure, one to a fever, the other to a knife, in some tavern squabble, and I was there with my hands up before they'd even finished calling for replacements. They needed bodies. I was willing. I signed my name on a parchment I couldn't read and boarded the Veil-born, with nothing but a ragged satchel and the ache of disbelief. I thought someone would stop me, call it a mistake, push me back down the gangplank. No one did. We set sail 2 days later, banners unfurling in the morning wind, the spires of Solmaris shrinking behind us, like they were ashamed to see us go. The sea was blue and cold and vast, the sky wider than I'd ever imagined. The crew numbered 200, give or take. I was no one among them. Rope man, deck scrubber, shadow, but it didn't matter. I was there. We were bound north, toward Illendor, across the Sea of Teeth, past the Shard Shoals and the ghost lights of Morofin. The journey would take weeks, maybe months, depending on the wind. Normally, it was a merchant route, or a convoy run for supplies and scrolls, but this time, the Veil-born carried something far more precious. Princess Rosin of Haldreth, born of the high bloodlines, betrothed to a prince whose name I didn't bother remembering. She was the crown jewel of the South, if you believed the songs. Graceful, untouchable, raised in marble courts and laced gardens, the kind of girl whose feet had never touched mud, whose breath had never fogged on salt air. We were to escort her to Illendor, deliver her safely to her future husband, and return home without so much as a whisper out of place. That was the plan. The royal guard took up most of the upper quarters, gleaming armor, bored eyes. They didn't speak to us unless it was to remind us of our place. The few glimpses I caught of her were through canvas curtains and the cracks of shield walls. She never looked down, never saw us, at least, not at first. The crew kept to themselves about it. No one talked about her, not where the officers could hear, but every sailor glanced upward when the wind caught her standard, when the silk banners of Haldreth rippled against the sky, and every one of us wondered what she was like. I tried not to. It didn't matter. After all, she belonged to a world of gold and ceremony. I belonged to the tar-slicked deck and the groan of rope through pulleys. We passed like stars, distant and burning. Still, sometimes, when I stood alone during night watches, gripping the rail and staring into the ink-dark waves, I'd imagine her awake somewhere above, staring at the same moon, wondering what lay beyond the edge of her maps. I told myself it was foolish, a story for a story's sake, but it was better than silence. The sea was kind. The first week, we moved swift and clean, the wind at our backs, and the stars above clear. The mages said the enchantments woven into the sails were singing, which meant the wormwood still liked the journey. Sailors listened when they said things like that. Below deck, the hammocks swayed like cradles, and the kitchen served hot stew 3 nights running. It felt like luck, like maybe this would be the one voyage I'd return from without scars. But even then, the other sailors were uneasy. The older ones muttered about the rote, about how we were making good time, too good, that the captain might try the channel. I didn't understand then, didn't know what the Virelay channel meant, didn't know what waited beneath. All I knew was the wind, and the ropes, and the ache in my hands, after 12 hours on deck, and her name, spoken like a prayer, beneath the breath of storm clouds, Rosen, a name I should never have dared to remember, but I did, and I would. She wasn't what I expected. Not a single word in the songs had prepared me for the way she moved, or how she looked when she thought no one was watching. Princess Rosen of Huldreth. I'd pictured her like the stories always did. Head held high, eyes cold as polished steel, voice like honey and law. The kind of noble that sailed through life without ever stepping in its mud. But the first time I saw her properly, she was alone at the prow, wind tugging her cloak loose, hair tangled and free. She looked like a girl trying very hard not to look like anything at all. She came to the deck more than she was supposed to, always flanked by her guards, always walking just behind the captain or her handmaidens, but never quite where they wanted her to be. She lingered near the rails, watched the ropes with too much focus, asked quiet questions the others tried to ignore. We weren't supposed to speak to her, that rule was clear. But she watched us, or maybe just me. It started with glances, from behind the silks of her canopy, from the upper deck while I scrubbed the main rigging. I caught her eyes once, quick and sharp, the green of them startling even in the pale light. She looked away just as fast, but not before something flickered there, recognition, or maybe just curiosity, like I wasn't part of the ship, but something unexpected. I didn't think much of it. The noble folk sometimes stare at the crew like we're strange beasts, harmless from afar, useful in a storm, best ignored otherwise. But then came the humming. I was working the mooring lines at dusk, near the windward side, when the old shanty slipped past my lips without thinking. A tune I'd learned before I had a name worth spitting. It was the sort of song sailors mutter to themselves when the sea goes too quiet, not loud, not even melodic, just a rhythm to keep the hands busy and the mind steady. She heard. I didn't know she was there. She'd crept down without her guards, a hood pulled over her hair, her footsteps light on the upper stairs. When she spoke, I nearly dropped the line from my hands. What does it mean? I turned too fast, heart jumping like a caught fish. She stood there, not 2 paces off, hands folded, face unreadable, not scared, not smug, just curious. I said nothing for a breath. Then too, she waited. It's just a song, I said at last. Old, she replied. Yes. Yours, no one's, everyone's. Her eyes studied mine, like she was trying to decide if that answer counted. The wind blew hard just then, tossing her hood back. Her hair spilled out, wild and dark, against the gray sky. I thought she looked more like the sea than the court. Will you tell me the words? She asked. I hesitated, then nodded. She sat on a coil of rope, like she'd done it 1,000 times, hands in her lap, not an ounce of royal posture in her spine. I knelt beside the lines, voice low, and spoke the verses as best I could remember. Some of the crew watched from a distance, but no one came near. Rosin listened without blinking. When I reached the end, she didn't smile, didn't speak, just stood again, and nodded, once. "Thank you," she said. Then she left. That was the first time. It wasn't the last. She returned 2 nights later, alone again, just after the watch bell struck. I was oiling the pulley chains, half asleep, and muttering to myself, when her shadow fell over the deck. This time she asked about the stars, where they went when the clouds took them, whether they remembered the sea when they vanished. I didn't have an answer, but I told her what we sailors believed, that the stars were sailors too, long dead, still watching the waves from above. She said she liked that it felt less lonely. After that, she came often, never for long, never when the guards were near. We spoke in the quiet hours between shifts, between bells, between breaths, always near the mooring lines, always behind the sails, or beneath the canopies. She asked questions. I answered. Then I asked questions, and she answered too, not like a noble, like a person. She told me she hated tea, that she'd never seen snow, that her favorite sound in the world was the hiss of foam against hull. I told her I hated spiders, that I couldn't swim, that I once tried to climb the lighthouse at Craymore and fell through the roof of a fishmonger's shed. She laughed, a real laugh, bright, short, sharp, like a bell struck once before silence. After that, I tried harder to make her laugh again. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes she only smiled, that half smile of hers that barely touched her mouth, but turned her eyes into something I couldn't stop looking at. We never touched, not once, but there were moments when I stood too close, or she leaned in too far, and I could feel something taut stretch between us, thin as a thread, sharp as wire, and I knew I'd fallen in love with her. It was madness. A boy from the slums, a girl born in golden halls. I didn't care. I would have followed her into a storm, would have pulled the stars from the sea, if she asked. I never said it. She never asked. The truth hung there, unspoken, waiting. The wind changed 2 days later. The crew whispered it, like a curse, that the current had bent too sharply, that the stars no longer matched the charts, that the Valeborn's pace had quickened again. And I heard the captain, speaking low to his first mate, eyes narrowed at the horizon. We would reach them all by morning. I didn't know what that meant, but Rosin did, and when she came to the deck that night, her eyes were already searching the waves. The sea grew quiet, not calm, quiet, the kind that sets your skin on edge, that steals the wind from the sails and makes the ropes hang limp like dead vines. Even the Valeborn seemed to feel it. Her wormwood hull, always humming beneath our feet, had dulled to a slow, wary throb, like a beast holding its breath. We'd entered the Varolay Channel, the moor, the crew called it, a cursed shortcut, an old sea road barely wide enough for a fleet's breath, threading through reefs. No sane captain sailed near. The legends say a god sleeps below it, coiled around the roots of the ocean, hateful of all that floats above. A kraken, older than names, older than tides. It wakes when it chooses, and when it does, it remembers. We were warned, but time pressed on the captain like a blade. There were whispers of winter storms ahead, of winds turning foul if we didn't reach Illendor in 5 days. We couldn't afford the longer route, so we turned into the moor. The stars vanished first, swallowed by high mist and rolling fog that crept in without wind. Then the water changed, losing its blue sheen, going dull and dark, like the scales of a drowned serpent. The sails no longer snapped, but sagged in the still air. Even the gulls abandoned us, and all the while the crew worked in silence. No shanties, No laughter, just the groan of wood and the clink of chains. I saw Rosin standing near the stern, her hands curled on the rail, face half hidden beneath her cloak. She hadn't spoken to me since the night before, not properly. Something about the silence had changed her. She looked like a falcon left too long in a cage, tight-shouldered, sharp-eyed, waiting for a storm that no one else could see. I wanted to speak to her, to break the spell, but I didn't know how. Not then. The fog grew thicker by the hour, coiling around the deck like smoke that didn't rise. The other ships in the fleet vanished into it, one by one. First the star flare, then the nightward. We kept a course only by the mage spheres lit on the mainmast, flickering green orbs that pulsed when the wind shifted. Even they seemed dimmer now. At midday, the captain ordered silence on the upper decks. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Every sailor knew the stories. We heard the sea breathing by nightfall, not the usual rhythm of waves and swell, but a slower, deeper sound, like something asleep just below the hull. A sound that didn't echo, a sound that didn't belong, and still we sailed forward. Just before midnight, I felt a hand brush mine. I turned, startled, and there she was. Rosin. No guards, no cloak, only her eyes, fierce and alive in the cold mist. "Walk with me," she said. We moved along the edge of the deck, quiet, slow. Around us, the world seemed to vanish, just fog, ropes, and shadow. But her presence cut through it, all like a lantern, in deep dark. "I thought you weren't allowed out here," I said softly. "I'm not," she replied. She didn't offer more. I didn't ask. We stopped near the prow, where the wormwood curled in its strange natural patterns, as if the tree that once lived had never fully died. The wind was barely a breath. The sea beneath was still. "Does it scare you?" she asked. "What?" "This place. The moor." I thought for a moment, then nodded. "Good," she said. "I don't trust people who aren't afraid of the sea." "You trust me." Another long pause, then a small crooked smile. "Maybe." I leaned on the rail beside her. The fog danced in faint tendrils across the water, rising and falling like breath. "I used to dream about sailing," she said, "when I was a girl, before the betrothal, before the silks and tutors. I used to sneak out at night, just to look at the stars, imagine what lay beyond the horizon. And now I'm living someone else's dream." I looked at her, but she didn't look back. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be. You didn't build the cage." "No," I said, "but I would have broken it, if I could." That made her look at me, really look. And for a moment, something shifted in her eyes, something raw, something that hadn't been there before. She reached for my hand. Her fingers barely touched mine. Then came the sound, low, distant, but unmistakable. A groan. Not wood, not wind, something deeper. The ship shuddered. A ripple rolled across the deck, gentle at first, like the pulse of a giant heart. Then again, stronger. The ropes swayed. The mage lights flickered. Someone screamed. We turned toward the noise and saw the fog split like torn cloth. The nightward. It was ahead of us, only barely visible through the gloom, but wrong. Listing, its stern lifted high above the water, and beneath it, black coils, thick as towers, moving. Rosin gasped. The sea opened like a wound. The nightward cracked, snapped, vanished. Silence fell for half a heartbeat. Then the veil-born reeled, the deck lurching sideways as the waves beneath us buckled. Sailors fell, ropes snapped. The mages on the upper platform raised shields. Green light sparking into the mist, and something moved beneath us. Huge, slow, ancient. The sea had awakened. I turned to her. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared, eyes wide, knuckles white on the rail. Then she whispered, "It's real." Another shudder rocked the ship. The crew began shouting orders. I turned to reach for her hand, but she was already gone, swept into the chaos, vanishing into the fog and fire and rising storm. I've heard men say they were in battles, real battles, steel and fire and death all around. That time slows when it happens, that the world narrows to one sound, one smell, one heartbeat. But this wasn't a battle. This was a reckoning. The sea bucked like a beast in pain, heaving the veil borne up and sideways. I hit the deck hard, ribs cracking against the rail, the taste of blood sharp in my mouth. All around me, shouts became screams. Orders vanished beneath thunder. The fog churned red with the light of dying mage flames. I scrambled to my feet, slipped, caught the nearest rope. A shape moved past the starboard side. No, not a shape. A tentacle, thick as a keep's tower, smooth, black, and dripping with sea brine that steamed when it touched the deck. It moved with slow, hateful grace, like it wasn't in a hurry, because it had all the time in the world to kill us. The nightwood was gone. One moment it had been there, a faint silhouette through the mist. The next, torn in half like kindling, dragged down into a churning black maw. The sea swallowed its bones, like they'd never mattered. The crew rallied fast. They had to. That's what the Veilborn was built for. War magic, sea monsters, old gods risen from the deep. But none of it mattered. Now, not when the first tentacle came down. It smashed the quarterdeck into splinters, crushed the captain's wheel to dust. One of the mages cast a shield, green blazing perfect, and it shattered like glass the moment the thing touched it. The scream that followed wasn't human. It was the ship. The Veilborn cried out, a sound deep in the wormwood, a groan that echoed through every beam and plank, like something inside her had cracked. I looked around wildly. She was gone. Rosin. I didn't see her by the rails, not near the upper mast, not beside the lifeboats or huddled with the guards. She was just gone. I ran. It didn't matter that the officers were screaming for order, that I was supposed to man the port quarter, that I was just a rope puller, a scrub boy with salt in his veins, and no rank to his name. None of it mattered, only she did. The deck tilted again, as another tentacle coiled around the mainmast. Wood shrieked, sailors shouted, fire broke somewhere near the munitions cache, and the sky turned orange with its breath. I slipped past a collapsing canopy, ducked under a falling beam, and ran below deck. Smoke stung my eyes. The wormwood was burning. Somehow, I didn't know it could. I shouted her name. Once, twice, no answer. I tore through the lower passage, boots sliding in water and blood. The wounded lay everywhere, some still breathing, some not. My heart pounded like a drum in my throat. Then I heard it, a voice, low, strained. I turned the corner and saw her, pinned beneath a fallen beam. One arm twisted under her, the other braced against the wood. Beside her, a guardsman, alive, barely bleeding from a gash across his temple. She wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to lift the beam off him. She looked up when she saw me. No surprise, just fire. Dropped beside her, shoved my shoulder under the beam, pushed until my vision blurred, until the wood groaned and shifted. She pulled the guard free with a grunt, dragging him out by his collar. When I let go, the beam slammed back down with a crack. We stared at each other, no words, just the sound of our breathing. and the screams above. Then she nodded, and we ran, together, up the stairs, through smoke and heat, and the roar of sea and storm. When we burst back onto the main deck, it was hell. Flames danced along the rigging. Sailors leapt from burning wood into black water. A tentacle slammed down only feet from us, smashing a lifeboat into flinders. The air was thick with ash and salt. We ducked under a broken spar, made for the upper quarter. The guard limped behind us, dragging his leg. A mage lay crumpled on the stairs. His hands still sparked, fingers twitching. I pulled his blade, steel old and chipped, but better than nothing. We reached the top deck, just as another crash sent the Veilborn listing hard to port. I grabbed the railing, pulled Rosen back from the edge. "You should have stayed at your post," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. I looked at her, sweat and soot streaking her cheeks, her eyes alive with defiance. "I'd rather die with you," I said, "than live as if you never mattered." She stared at me, then her hand found mine, only for a second, but it was enough. Another scream split the sky. The beast was coming back, and the ship wouldn't hold much longer. The deck broke open between us. It happened so fast. I barely saw the tentacle fall, just a shadow, a rush of air, and then wood exploded beneath our feet. I was flung backward, landing hard against the rail. For a moment, all I saw was sky and fire, ropes whipping past, ash falling like snow. When I pushed myself up, coughing through the smoke, she was gone. I shouted her name again, but the wind took it. I forced myself to stand, blinking against the sting of sweat and soot. All around me, the Veilborn was coming apart. The sails were aflame. The mainmast hung at a broken angle, creaking like a dying tree. Mages fired spellbursts into the sea, lighting up coils of black muscle below. None of it mattered. I only looked for her. A hand grabbed my shoulder. First Mate Lorne, blood running down his temple. "Brenna, port quarter. Now. We need every man." I nodded without thinking, turned toward the burning hull, but I didn't go. I stood there, heart pounding, the order ringing in my ears like a curse. Port quarter. That was the last hold. The beast was breaching again there. We needed to hold it back, needed every blade, but she was below deck. I knew it, felt it in my bones, and so I ran, down through the flames, through buckled stairs and flooded halls, through corridors that groaned and split with every breath the ship took. The Veilborn was dying, and I was chasing a ghost. She wasn't in the main hold, not in the infirmary, not in the lower crew quarters. Then I heard it, metal against wood, struggling. I turned a corner and found her beneath the wreckage of the officers' gallery. One arm braced against a fallen beam, trying to lift it with her shoulder while dragging the same wounded guard from before. Her hands were shaking. Her face was pale, but she hadn't stopped. Neither did I. I dropped beside her without a word, braced my back against the beam, gritted my teeth, and pushed. Together we heaved it up, just enough for the guard to crawl free, groaning with every inch. His armor scraped along the floor, leaving a trail of blood. We let the beam fall with a crash. She collapsed beside me, breathing hard, her forehead slick with sweat. "You came back," she said. I nodded, couldn't speak. She looked at me, eyes full of fire and disbelief. "You should have stayed at your post. I'd rather die with you than live as if you never mattered." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't clever, but it was the truth. Something cracked in her then, something that had been holding too tight for too long. Her hand found mine, fingers rough with splinters and blood, and she held on, only for a moment. But it burned like a brand. Then the ship groaned again, louder than before, a tearing sound. We scrambled up the nearest stairwell, half dragging the guard between us. The deck above was a different world now, half of it gone, swallowed by fire, or broken apart by the beast's limbs. I saw the star flare in the distance, her sails untouched, too far to help, and I saw her, Rosin's handmaiden, waving from one of the last lifeboats, her face pale, eyes wide. A guardsman grabbed Rosin by the arm. "This way, my lady, now." She hesitated, looked at me. I couldn't speak. Another crash. The mast began to fall. We dove to the side as it smashed across the deck, splitting the wood in two, sending a rain of sparks into the air. When I looked up, she was already being pulled away. "To know," I shouted, lunging forward. A beam slammed down in front of me. Fire licked at the rails. Smoke blinded me. I clawed through the wreckage, pushing past heat and flame, staggering toward the edge of the deck. I saw her, just once, standing in the lifeboat, her eyes locked to mine. The boat drifted, ropes cut, sails unfurling as it veered toward the star flare, and then she was gone. The Veilborn shuddered again. The beast was still here, and I was still aboard. The Veilborn was dying, not breaking, dying. There was something in the way the wormwood moaned beneath my boots, something final in the way the sails folded in on themselves, limbs gone limp. I could feel her breath slowing, the heart of her stilled, like even the ship knew it couldn't outrun this end. The beast was coming back. I heard it before I saw it, a low thunder in the water, a pressure that curled my spine and made my teeth ache. The sea trembled, the fog boiled, the stars above disappeared entirely, swallowed by clouds thick as smoke. Then the tentacle rose, huge, black, wet with seawater and fire. It coiled over the starboard side, like it meant to claim the ship itself, dragging its weight across the deck, crushing what remained of the officer's platform. I dove behind a shattered rail, ducked as splinters sprayed past me, stung by heat and salt. The crew was gone. What few remained were scattered across the ship, cut off from one another by flame or fallen mast. A few figures still fought near the forecastle, but I couldn't hear their shouts, only the groan of wood and the hiss of burning sails. I stood, swallowed, and looked toward the star flare. It gleamed in the distance, untouched by the battle, her sails white and full, and there at the stern, just visible through the gaps in the mist, I saw her, Rosin, alive, watching. Her face was pale, streaked with soot. Her hands gripped the edge of the lifeboat, knuckles white. She didn't call to me. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. I tried to move, tried to reach her, but another crash split the deck between us. A tentacle slammed down near the lifeboats, shattering the last of the longboats, sending a spray of broken wood into the sea. I was cut off, alone. I held her gaze just long enough. Then she vanished into the mist. The star flare moved farther away, sails filling with a wind we no longer felt. Safe, sailing clear. Good. I exhaled. That was enough. I turned back toward the mast. The last storm flare was still strapped to the rigging, an enchanted beacon meant to signal allies in the worst conditions. A bright, burning spellfire designed to cut through any storm or lure something to it. I limped toward it, half climbing, half hauling myself up the shattered rigging. The mast groaned beneath me, ropes slick with blood and brine. I slipped once, caught myself, higher, closer. The lightning lit the sky. The clouds opened, rain began to fall, thin, sharp, cold. At the top of the mast, I found the flare. My hands shook as I untied it. I struck the rune on its side. It hissed, glowed, then burst into life, red and gold, blinding against the grey, a pillar of flame. The beast saw it. The sea split again. A shape rose, huge, pulsing, covered in barnacles and old scars. A head, if you could call it that. A maw of tendrils spiraling around a single gleaming eye, black as oil and deeper than the world. It turned toward me and screamed. The sound hit me like a hammer, bursting across the sea, shaking the mast beneath my feet. I held on, teeth clenched, arms burning. It came for me, fast, hungry. I looked one last time across the waves. No sign of her. That was good. She was safe. I closed my eyes as the tentacle rose. Let the storm take me. Let the sea remember. The sky went silent. Not quiet, silent. Like everything had stopped breathing at once. Rain hovered in the air like forgotten tears. The flare burned above me, casting flickering gold across the broken mast, the shattered sails, the torn skin of the Valborn. My hands were slick on the rigging, fingers numb, lungs raw from smoke. The kraken watched me. It hung in the water like a nightmare given shape, tendrils rippling just beneath the surface, its vast, ink-black body coiled around the bones of the ship. That single eye, enormous, unblinking, locked on mine, cold, alien, timeless. It knew I'd called it. It knew why, and it came. The mast cracked beneath my feet as the beast rose higher, dragging itself upward in impossible silence. The sea parted around it, water spilling away in sheets, as the thing emerged from the deep, like some old god returned from the grave. Its tendrils flared outward, curling over the ship, over the last of the deck, and still, I didn't move. I could have run, thrown myself into the sea, dived for the wreckage of a longboat, maybe even found some broken plank to cling to, until the star flare circled back. It wasn't too late, but I didn't. I held the flare high, even as the heat burned my palm, because if the beast chased me, it might chase them too, and she was on that ship. She had to live. So I stood on the mast, like a lighthouse on a broken coast, and faced the end. The kraken struck. Not down forward. One of its tendrils lashed through the mast, ripping it from the deck like a twig. I went flying, weightless, for a moment, air stolen from my lungs, flare tumbling from my hand in a trail of sparks. I hit the deck hard, rolled, slammed into the rail. Everything went black for a breath. When I opened my eyes, the sky was churning. The flare lay a few feet away, still burning, cracked, but lit. The kraken hovered above the ship, its bulk blocking out the last of the stormlight, and beneath it, the Veilborn heaved one last time, her wormwood groaning from the inside out. This was the end, and still, I had one thing left. I crawled, blood in my mouth, bones screaming, every breath a fire. I reached the forward hold, half collapsed, metal twisted from the beast's first strike. Among the debris lay the old harpoons, the fire-forged ones, enchanted long ago, meant for sea beasts the world no longer believed in. I grabbed one. It was heavier than I remembered. I dragged it to the deck, where the creature loomed, where the eye still stared. I lit the fuses with the last spark from the flare, and when the kraken reached down for me, I threw. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't perfect, but it flew. The harpoon slammed into the creature's eye with a wet crack, burying itself deep. The kraken screamed, not with pain, with rage. The sound shattered what remained of the Valborn's deck, split the sky open, sent waves spilling into the broken ribs of the ship. The beast reared back, flailing, crashing into the sea with such force that the ocean surged upward, swallowing everything in its wake, and me with it. I didn't fight the water, didn't kick, didn't scream. I let it take me. The cold wrapped around my chest like chains. My eyes blurred. My limbs gave out. The last thing I heard was a voice, faint but clear, woven into the roar of the sea. Don't let go. It was hers. I picture Princess Rosen arriving in Illendor, days ahead of schedule. I can see her now, stepping off the starflare barefoot, her dress torn and wild, her hair unbound, the salt still clinging to her skin like it was part of her soul. The lords who were waiting for her, they were stunned. She looked so regal, so silent, so strangely distant. She never spoke of what happened out at sea. No one sang songs for the Veilborn. No questions were ever answered. She married him, the prince, the one her father promised her to. I picture the ceremony, quiet, but grand in its way. The nobles cheered, the bells rang, and the people of Illendor lined the roads with wild flowers. But she never smiled, not once. She wears a sailor's pendant beneath her wedding silks, a shard of bone, carved smooth by salt and time, tied to a frayed piece of rigging cord. No one ever dared to ask where it came from. And now, she walks alone. The sea palace has towers she never leaves. She stands at the high windows during storms, staring out past the cliffs, watching the waves. Her handmaidens often find her in the garden at dawn, barefoot in the dew, eyes rimmed red from dreams she doesn't speak of. She rules with grace, with poise. The people love her, but they know she's not with them. She's far away, like something in her never made it back. And I know what it is. I'm still here, floating, drifting. The flare's long since gone out. The sky above is the color of worn steel, and the sea is calm in that terrible, knowing way. The wreckage creaks beneath me, a splinter of the mast that once held the sails of the greatest ship ever built, the Veilborn. I don't feel my hands anymore. My breath comes shallow. My skin's gone numb. I stop trying to count the hours. There's no one else, no ships, no stars, only water and her in my mind. At the edge of every blink, Rosin standing at the bow of the star flare, hair streaming in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. That last look, the one that said everything. I wonder if she ever sings the old song, the one I hummed with rope in my hands and salt in my teeth. I hope she doesn't forget it. I hope she knows I stayed. I try to whisper her name, but my lips barely move. The sea is warm now. Strange, like it forgives me. Or maybe it never hated me at all. I think I hear her voice, distant and soft. Don't let go. I hold on, just a little longer, picturing her as the waves carry me down.